Hailed once as a miracle cure and now considered a form of surgically induced brain damage, the lobotomy has a place as one of the most bemusing solutions to a problem that is still poorly understood today: psychosis. Used to silence the hallucinations and ideations of those suffering from debilitating mental illnesses long before there were any drug interventions, it was used historically both in the treatment of conditions such as schizophrenia or, from a more sinister perspective, to silence problem patients. Howard Dully is one of the many patients that received the radical procedure during the early 20th century. He was just 12 years old at the time of the procedure. But before I dive into his story, first a little background into the science, or rather the art, of the lobotomy. On our journey to unravel the mysteries of the human mind, we've tried many ways to manage those whose ideas and thought processes differ to ours to a point where they no longer become functioning members of society, and with it have come interventions that have both changed things for the better and for the worse. And while most people would think that the lobotomy was the first invasive technique in psychiatric care, it was preceded by a few millennia by a technique known as trepanning, or drilling holes into the skull to release evil spirits. Now, the first documented case of trepanning or trepanation was seen in the Neolithic period, over 7,000 years ago, and was used in some cases to release evil spirits that may have been trapped within the patient's skull, leading to their deviant behaviours. The difference between the time of the procedure and the age of the skull that died suggested that some of these patients actually lived on for years after the procedure. But one wonders how painful they could have been, with some records saying it took up to 50 minutes, and I quote, counting periods for rest due to fatigue, to get into the skull in the first place. Some records even suggest that pieces of the skull were worn around their neck as a charm afterwards. To my surprise, it seems some of these early techniques were actually used as a primitive way of releasing pressure from the skull and the brain, where blood can sometimes pool after trauma. It seemed these early neurosurgeons were trying something that is still used in a modified way today as burr holes. By the time the lobotomy came around, our understanding of the human mind had advanced, and our understanding shifted from evil spirits to trying to identify and find an organic cause for mental illness. Now, there are various techniques for the procedures, but the most chilling statement by surgeons at the time was that although the outcomes were poor and variable, and their effects on patients questionable, there was no other alternative. Patients in mental health facilities were subject to horrendous conditions, straitjackets, violence, abuse at the hands of their carers, and isolation. Igaz Moniz's simple reinvention of trepanning as leucotomy early in the 20th century spread across the globe, with variations made upon it by several prominent surgeons in the years that followed. His original monograph depicted how the procedure aimed to remove the contribution of the frontal lobe, responsible for behaviour, speech, as a way to deal with overactive emotions. This produced radical changes in patients, many of which had severe complications in their ability to control their speech and thought, losing their motivation and emotional response to life. Some were institutionalised for the remainder of their lives. Walter Freeman, a zealous proponent of the procedure, performed over 2,500 lobotomies using an ice pick that was hammered through the corner of the patient's eye socket. He sometimes opted to do this without anaesthetic, instead inducing the patient into an unconscious state through a series of electric shocks. Now, the question remains as to what the real reason was to perform these surgeries, as for many patients the benefits just weren't worth the risk. Which brings me to an altogether more disturbing conclusion that this wasn't meant to be a treatment, this perhaps wasn't meant to provide any new groundbreaking therapy, but was designed to make them easy to deal with. Now, without the proper drug treatments to manage these patients at the time, they were unable to integrate into society, and they were said to pose a danger both to themselves and the health staff responsible for their care, who were ill-equipped to deal with their specific needs. For many, this meant a life of isolation and a fundamental misunderstanding between themselves and the society around them. Now, this technique was championed as a cure-all of sorts. Patients would come in with a variety of presentations, anything from something like persistent migraines all the way to violent suicidal thoughts and aggression. The lack of appropriate drug treatments at the time, coupled with the overcrowding of many psychiatric institutions, could have pushed doctors to employ radical techniques despite doubts about their efficacy. Now, this brings me back to Howard Dully, the boy who was subjected to a lobotomy by the hands of Walter Freeman at the age of 12. He was diagnosed by Freeman as someone suffering from childhood schizophrenia, so you may think, well, he would have been a perfect candidate to undergo the procedure at the time. But a little more digging, and you'll find that numerous other medical professions had argued the diagnosis, suggesting he showed no such signs of a psychiatric disorder. Now, his mother died of cancer when he was just 5. His father remarried, and his aggressive or distant behaviour may well have been him going through phases of childhood grief, some other psychiatric disorder, or he was just your typical discontented little boy. To make matters more unclear, it seems as if his new stepmother was a key protagonist and the one to reach out to Freeman, citing his behaviour as barely endurable. And the two, in all likelihood, found a way to persuade his father to go along with the procedure. Now, Howard Dully is 72 years old today and spent much of his life struggling with his identity and sense of self. Although his memories of that time are scant and distant, he recalls that he has felt as if a piece of him was missing ever since. I'll never know what I lost in those 10 minutes with Dr. Freeman and his ice pick. Now, the lobotomy is still performed today in some small measure for extreme cases of OCD in a much more regulated way. And there is research being undertaken to make the procedure more precise. If we could actually perform nanosurgery to alter specific neural pathways, there may be ways to reduce the consequences of certain mental illness without the side effects that accompany lobotomies today. And the lobotomy also played no small role in paving the way for techniques such as deep brain stimulation, which are still used today for movement disorders like Parkinson's disease. Today, the stigma around speaking to and confronting mental health issues is still widespread, and while we are beginning to open the floor to our fellow neurodiverse human beings, we are continually finding ways to modulate their behaviour through pharmacological intervention, through mechanisms we still don't understand completely. You may even find places around the world that use drugs to put difficult patients into a medically induced straitjacket. And it leads one to question whether a pharmacologically induced lobotomy is just as sinister as the crude practices we have moved on from. Thank you for sticking with me until the end and joining me on this journey to investigate the hearts and minds of doctors and scientists that came before me. If you would like to support the channel, you know what to do, and see you in the next episode.